Morning.
Hello.
How you doing?
A little nervous.
A little bit?
A little bit. A little bit.
We've only talked about this quite a bit over the last couple of weeks, wouldn't you say?
Quite a bit. Quite a bit.
So
here we go.
Here we go. So what is this that we're talking about? Or maybe more importantly, before we even get to what we are talking about this morning.
Who are we?
And why are we talking about
it?
Well, if you don't know us, in order to introduce ourselves, my name is David Roberts. My pronouns are he, him, his, and I am one of the pastors on staff here at Watershed. And in the genesis of this series, Love in the Time of Corona, originally I was scheduled to do a solo sermon today, or whatever you want to call it, when there's just one person up here talking. And just in conversations with people in our community, shout out to Chris and to Blair.
Partner Chris.
Tommy's partner Chris. We kind of realized that we were having a conversation about love, about relationships, about identity, and things like that. And one of the most kind of important groups within our community wasn't being represented, and that was the queer community. And so it began to evolve. It shifted from something that I was going to do myself to a conversation that maybe I would have with Tommy. And kind of at the early onset of it, we thought we were going to talk about masculinity, because Tommy, as you'll hear in a moment, identifies as a queer person, and I, in many ways, though I am a straight cisgendered male, in many ways, I don't fit what is typically, I think, the stereotypical mold of masculinity in the West and in this country. And so we thought that's a good starting point. But the more we...
some pretty pictures of you and your daughters.
They're very pretty.
Yeah.
Mostly them than me, but I mean, I am also in those pictures. But it became obvious very quickly, I would say, as we were prepping for this, that this conversation was bigger than merely a talk about masculinity. We had to begin to unpack this word.
Yeah.
Queer.
Yeah. So, hello, my name is Tommy Allgood. No, that is not my last name for those of you wondering, but it is what we're going to go with today. I am actually serve on the diversity and inclusivity team here at Watershed as well, and my pronouns are he, they. So that would put me as a transgendered individual, and that is the first time I have ever said that publicly, although I have been using the pronouns he, they for a while. So sort of, as you know in life, coming out it's never just a one-time thing. We're always coming out, and as we'll talk about a little bit, about sexuality, about gender, these things exist on a spectrum. And I think it's really important to bring this conversation into this space, because the church has had a big part in hurting the queer community by creating exclusive spaces. And so one of the things that was also on my heart and also on my mind was that people have probably used the time of the coronavirus and quarantine to step away from churches and from their institutions. We know that we have new people here, and while we explicitly are affirming and welcoming and inclusive, full stop, it's good that we talk about it. It's good to have representation, and so hopefully with parts of my story and parts of your knowledge and your experience, we're able to just begin to introduce a conversation. And one of the things that we're going to talk about is relating to God through this process of queer theology.
So kind of just to start out, with that kind of Tommy laying the groundwork there, we want to say a few things about what this conversation will be, or what we hope it to be, but crucially in that also what this conversation won't be. And the won't be piece is big, because I think often if perhaps this is your experience, if you've heard conversations around queer identity or LGBT, gay, lesbian, transgender, anything that kind of falls within that umbrella, if you've heard those conversations in a church space or a spiritual space, they typically, in my experience at least, and I think this has been true at Watershed as well, fall under the umbrella of what we're going to call apologetics. This idea that we're going to be making the case through scripture or experience or what have you, as to why the lives and experiences and identities of people who identify as LGBTQ are okay. Why they're allowed to exist, and
that's just okay, but beautiful.
Right. And that's an important conversation. It's one that we've had here at Watershed. It's one that I hope we will continue to have here at Watershed. It's also not, at least not precisely the conversation we're planning on having here this morning.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and when I think about my experience growing up, so much of it was this trying to root into justifying my existence and my body by this process of apologetics or this reasoning in Scripture. And throughout my life, what I've really come to learn is, as some of these pictures are showing, that really one of the ways that I interact with the divine is through my body and through my expression. And oftentimes that doesn't fit into a nice, tidy gender norm. And what we'll also talk about is how trying to fit into these boxes can be deeply, deeply oppressive. And so with that, what I want to do is set some groundwork here. A couple weeks ago, Matt talked about or presented us this sort of closed fist, open hand. And I want to ask to bring that back. What Matt also didn't realize is a couple weeks ago, he was actually setting also some of the foundations for queer theology and how we talk about those things. And so we also, here at Watershed, when we're talking about scriptures and talking about having this conversation beyond apologetics, we don't necessarily believe that the Word of God is like inerrant or infallible, but rather it positions us to see the narrative and how people interacted and walked with God. Short and simple, queer people have always been here, and so we're going to try to attempt to articulate this in our discussion today through how queer theology might look at the Bible and interpret it. Also give you some resources as well.
Yeah, so a couple things. One, before we get to the biblical part, the scriptural part, there's a few kind of definitions that Tommy and I want to lay out. But I also want to give everyone a heads up. So when our conversation here is done, in a little bit, don't log off right away. If you would stick around with us for a few minutes, Tommy and I are actually going to stay up here on stage, and we're going to answer questions that maybe have come up during our conversation. And so if we say something that's confusing, because to some degree we even realize this in the prep process, we are covering so much ground. Could be a whole sermon series. Not going to fit into our conversation. And so I got my phone up here. Tommy's got his iPad. If you have questions, feel free to put them in the comments. Some of the other staff who are here will be feeding those questions to us. And then at the end, during that Q&A time, there'll be an opportunity for you to submit those as well. So we know we're not going to be able to answer every question that gets raised. We still have questions. But it's going to be our attempt to be as kind of holistic and thorough as possible in that.
So I think the first thing let's talk about is we've used the term cisgendered and transgendered. What do those mean? So you, as a cis person, what does that mean?
It means, or at least as I understand it, it means that I identify, my gender identity matches the sex or the sex organs that I was identified with or assigned at birth. And so I in the way that, kind of biology or anatomy defines maleness, I identify with that.
Yeah. So, and then what you're seeing on the screen here is this graphic, transgender, and sort of this umbrella. So under the umbrella, there is binary and non-binary. And we'll talk about more ways in which sort of we cisgender people tend to think about this. Trans is a spectrum of identity. Some people choose to transition. Other people don't transition. So my friend Tyler actually sent this graphic this week, and I was like, this is a really helpful way to begin to understand what is categorized under the transgender identity. People may choose to present in a particular way, or they may, as me, present in my male body, right? And then, but gender is really not about sex or physicality. It's more about these roles and these constructs that we align ourselves and construct ourselves into society. And so before we get to that, because I think we're going to talk about normativity, and there's definitions for that, but let's talk about the word queer. And that comes with a lot of baggage. And if you're squirming in your seat and uncomfortable, I get it, because that word has been used to dehumanize, and it has been used in a derogatory way for quite some time. And so especially you might see a generational gap in this. Older people of the LGBTQ IA community might not use this word. Other people who, millennials like myself, Gen Z, might be more comfortable with this word because it's going through this process of reclamation. And it's also been positioned as this political identity because there's political implications when we think about structures, institutions that hold power and position themselves to dictate how other bodies or lives should move.
Right. So with that said, kind of with that important caveat, I think we have some definitions that we want to get to. And so really we're gonna define kind of 4 big words here. We're gonna look at kind of queer identity or queerness. We're gonna look at the word theology and what we mean, by theology, and then by extension queer theology. And then 2 other words, normativity and essentialism. Okay. So we want to start with queerness?
So it might also be helpful for you to know where some of this groundwork foundation is coming from. We kind of are drawing from 2 books, and we've actually you've gotten to speak to one of the people that we're talking about, Lynn Tonstad. She has authored the book Queer Theology. That's one of the references that you'll see pop up. And then the other is by this theologian, Reverend Dr. Pamela Lightsey. And she's authored this book, Our Lives Matter. And it takes a womanist approach to queer theology. And so in that means she takes an intersectional approach in centering the Black female presenting or female body, right?
Yep.
And so in that, this quote about queerness comes from Pamela. She says, "We have reclaimed queer as an active word, a questioning word, a creative word, and a challenging word. When we queer disciplines such as history, literature, or religion, we are actively looking for queer people who have been hidden or lost by those disciplines. To queer these disciplines is also to challenge their homophobic bases. Queer is also an indeterminate or generative word, pointing to all the ways all identities are fluid and changing. To oversimplify, queer is resistance to being put in a box. Can't hold me down."
Right. So if that's what queer is, theology is typically, in its most simple sense, theology is just the study of God, or what we talk about when we talk about God. The argument that we're going to put forth to you today is that historically, theology, especially when it's done along normative lines, which we're going to get to, is typically a means of reinforcing the boxes. The theology has been used historically to both construct and defend certain hierarchies, certain ways of justifying the way things are, the status quo. And if you want to, if we unpack how that works, it's this idea that, and this is we're bleeding into the normativity section because all these things interact, but it's this idea that, in order to justify exploitation or oppression or privilege of certain kind, we appeal to God. We appeal to nature that we say God has designed, to kind of say this is the way that God has ordered things or designed things. This is the way things are. And so historically, theology has often been used as a means of reinforcing these oppressions. But what we want to queer theology.
Yeah, so queer theology would add another layer to that in how people relate to faith and spirituality and the doctrines that specifically impact the lives of queer people. And so it's truly looking through it through a lens of sexuality and how our bodies are in position and in relation to one another. And so it's really this living theology. It puts us in community with one another. And so I think it would be helpful then to move. Oh, what are you going to say?
I think I'm predicting what you're going to say. So finish your.
No. I was just going to say that might take us into what we might call the prison of normativity.
Prison of normativity. So there's a reason that this conversation necessarily needs to be centered around queer bodies and bodies that and expressions of love and relationship that don't fit the norm. Mm-hmm. So what are we saying by norm? The norm is, you might hear, people talk about systems and structures. When we're talking about justice and oppression here at Watershed, we often do that. We might talk about systemic racism, or we might use a word like patriarchy. Our friend Dr. Robin Henderson Espinoza has used the term supremacy culture.
Yeah, great conversation. go back and listen to it.
All of these are forms of normativity. It's the way that we order or structure our society and our relationships, both in an official sense, like the government, but also unofficially with like cultural norms and expectations. All of these things that we take for granted as simply the way they are, the way things are, and therefore using those systems to prop up in-groups and out-groups, hierarchies, top and bottom, things like that. Every way of ordering ourselves within the world that privileges some at the expense of others.
Yeah. So if you want a simple slide for that, normativity is the phenomenon in human societies of designating some actions or outcome as good or desirable or permissible and others as bad or undesirable or impermissible.
Right. So this notion of normativity also goes with this notion of essentialism. Because what happens is we have these structures. They're constructs. They're arbitrary. We make them up. But then we essentialize them. And this gets back to the theology piece. This gets back to the way that we justify the way things are by appealing to God or to nature, sometimes both at the same time, and saying that this is essential. This is the way that Tommy is the only way Tommy could be, and it's the way God designed. And that might kind of sound good at first, but sometimes even in affirmation, it traps us kind of in these boxes of essentialism. And so the queer experience, the queer identity, is the identity or the body that sort of introduces a rupture or a cut. It undermines what we often unconsciously take for granted as normative, as the status quo, as the way things are. And that cut, even sometimes when we're attempting to be inclusive or diverse and things like that, that rupture can be deeply disruptive. It can make us incredibly uncomfortable at sometimes a visceral bodily level, to the point where we can't even put it to words sometimes.
Yeah, and that's a form, in a lot of ways, that's a form of privilege, experiencing that disruption, right? It allows you to understand that you might be carrying some privilege. But what might that look like? How can we contextualize this, especially these ideas of cisgendered or cisgendered privilege, right? Well, this social activist, Sam Killerman, has this privilege list, very much like Peggy McIntosh's knapsack for white supremacy or checking off privileges. So I just want to read some of these, and if you have these, then you have cisgendered privilege. If you can use public restrooms without fear of verbal abuse, physical intimidation, or arrest, you have cis privilege. If you can use public facilities such as gym locker rooms and store changing rooms without stares, fear, or anxiety. If strangers don't assume they can ask you what your genitals look like and how you have sex. If your validity as a man, woman, or human is not based on how much surgery you've had or how well you pass as non-transgender. You have the ability to walk through the world and generally blend in, not being constantly stared at or gawked at, whispered about, pointed at, or laughed at because of your gender expression. You can access gender-exclusive spaces such as Michigan's Women's Music Festival, Greek Life, or Take Back the Night and not be excluded due to your trans status. You can reasonably assume that your ability to acquire a job, rent an apartment, secure a loan will not be denied on the basis of your gender identity expression. Having your gender as an option on a form, being able to tick a box on a form without disagreeing, and someone telling you that you're lying. Yes, this actually happens. Being able to pretend that anatomy and gender are irrevocably intertwined when having the boy parts and girl parts talk with children, instead of actually explaining the complexity of the issue of living in our bodies.
And so we're sort of elevating or centering the trans identity, the trans experience, because it's the experience of the world, the way of being in the world that most comes into conflict with normativity. But maybe I assume for most of you, you might not relate to that. But I want to make this accessible for everyone. If you if you identify as male, but maybe your experience of maleness doesn't match the stereotype that is seen on TV or seen in the movies, you've run up against the normativity of patriarchy and found that you don't fit. And so sometimes you're performing, sometimes you're trying to, make up that gap. Then you've run up against this to some degree. If you identify as a female or as a woman, and your experience of femininity or just your experience of your body in your life doesn't match the norm, doesn't match the stereotype, the expectations of what a woman should be or a person who identifies as a woman should be, then this affects you as well. To some degree, we want to suggest that there's a universality to this. You might genuinely experience, as I do, you might genuinely experience cis privilege and fit the norms of a society better than many, and yet you are not immune from kind of the supremacy culture around these notions of normativity. At some point, you won't fit the mold.
Yeah. So, since we're not doing apologetics, though, what is a way that we might be able to look towards Scripture and see the queer experience presented there?
Sure. So I want to maybe the most bold thing I'm going to say this morning is that I think that this notion of rupture that the queer experience gifts to us is at the very heart of the gospel. If we think about normativity as this attempt to save ourselves, this attempt to create a sort of security in the world, often these hierarchies of oppression that we are complicit in, both consciously and unconsciously, they exist to
capitalism,
imperialism. Most isms that you can think of, our economic systems, our government, all of this. They're attempts at self-salvation. What the gospel narrative does, what the death of Jesus did, both in context and for us today, is it strips us of that security. So back in the context of Jesus' actual life, death, and resurrection, there was this moment of rupture, this moment where everything that Jesus' followers thought was going to happen, the people of Israel thought was going to happen in relation to their political situation under Roman oppression. If you want to be especially scandalous, which I typically do, you could even argue that within the gospel narrative itself, especially the book of Mark, there's this sense in which things don't even play out the way Jesus thought they were going to happen. And so there's this complete rupture of security, of expectation unmet, this way in which what was normative, what was considered the right way to do life, to do theology, to save ourselves, was rendered null and void and inadequate. The death of God, the experience of dereliction, of forsakenness, that Jesus cried out on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me? This is the moments wherein the norms were shattered.
Yeah, I like that you used the term in our discussion, the apocalypse of queer identity. So in talking about that rupture, it almost functions like this apocalypse, and that sounds very like gloom and doom, but apocalypse simply means this uncovering, right?
So it's a word that's associated with the end of the world, but it's the end of the world in the sense that things are being revealed as they really are. So what the systems that we take for granted as normative are being revealed, unmasked, unveiled as limited, as fallible, as problematic, as rife with contradiction. And born out of the end of the world, the old world that's fading away, is possibility, is creativity, is imagination. And so out of that death comes the resurrection experience, which I think it's crucial to our conversation in the Gospels. The resurrection experiences they're bizarre. Yeah. The resurrected Christ is met as a stranger on the road. Christ is met as is mistaken for the gardener, is perceived to be a ghost, and then right when the disciples are maybe risking objectifying the resurrected Christ, then we get the ascension narrative, and the body of Christ is literally taken away, and what do we get instead? We get this Spirit who is even more disruptive, who comes in and just solidifies this non-normative scrambling. If you're familiar with the Pentecost story, the Apostle Peter is telling the story of Jesus, and the Spirit comes in, and suddenly everyone is able to hear his message in their own language. And that's a key point to our point here, because people sometimes think of the story of the Tower of Babel, where everyone used to speak the same language, and then God scrambled their languages, and they're like, oh, Pentecost is the reversal of Babel. But it's not. It's the fulfillment. If it reversed Babel, it would have reestablished this kind of normative language, this normative way of being.
It's one way of being.
But Pentecost comes in and everyone's able to hear kind of this universal message of the gospel in their own tongue. So it sort of, if it makes anything normative, it makes non-normativity normative.
Yeah. So in that, what I'm hearing is that the queer body is this disruption to the norm. And I think even here at Watershed, we've experienced that, and it's grown us, and it continues to grow us. It continues to push us. It continues to expand us in ways in which we thought that we should be, or the love that we thought was appropriate, right? This single-minded, monogamous love, it begs, the queer body begs us to question, is that it? Is that all that's welcome into this space? One of the questions that I posed to Matt a few weeks ago is like, well, would sex workers be welcomed in this space? Would a drag queen who came in all dressed to the dimes, right, be welcomed into this space? And they should be, because the gift of that, the queer body, is that it creates this disruption or this uncovering, and I think aligns us more closely to this experience of oneness with the divine.
So if you think about the way that the image of the cross works, the scandal of the cross is that, first off, that God identifies God's self with broken humanity, even to the point of death, on the cross. And it's, Paul in the book of Galatians talks about this idea that, I'm crucified in Christ. It's no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. I desire to know nothing but Christ and him crucified. The same way that scandalous image works, that's exactly what's going on when we're confronted with the queer body. Yeah. It's this disruption of our expectations of what God must be and be like, which then sort of puts to death a way of being in the world that can't fit that in, and kind of opens us up to the creative, imaginative possibilities of what could be. That's the what we're arguing. That's the gift of queer theology.
Yeah. So, I guess where does that take us? What are some of the implications of that, and what are the implications of this normative culture that we're trying to break apart from, or bump up against, and dismantle and rebuild new structures in which people are actually included and centered at the table, especially the queer body, the queer black body, right?
Well, I'm glad you mentioned the intersectionality there, because if I was to, because like we said, this is the beginning of a conversation. Tommy and I are, we're starting to land the plane here. We're wrapping up our conversation, and we've only scratched the surface. So we're hoping that this is kind of the first of what, as many conversations around these lines here at Watershed. But Tommy mentioned the queer body, the queer black body. The way that this works in our society is the same way that maybe the Black Lives Matter movement works. If you want to be better attuned to these points of rupture in the normative way of being in the world, in the normative systems that are ordering our society, look at where the strongest resistance is. Look at the bodies, and in our current cultural moment, I would say that that's queer bodies and black bodies. Look at the bodies that are marshaling the most visceral resistance, most visceral kind of upholding of the status quo and kind of the way things are. That's going to be the point of liberation. Yeah. If we organize our solidarity at those points in our society, not just in an abstract sense, literally surrounding, elevating and centering those individuals, that's going to be a point of universal emancipation, universal liberation for everyone. But it has to start at those threads. Yeah. That if we need a place to start pulling, to allow the whole edifice to come undone.
And for me, that process has played out in how, as I'm dealing with my theologies and learning, I love womanist theology, which is intersecting with liberation theology, which is intersecting with queer theology. And so I think of the Black church, and there's a beautiful documentary out on PBS now, and I hope that we can all watch it together as a community, in addition to some other documentaries. And they devote about 4 minutes to talking about queer people existing in Black spaces, but the truth is that we've always been here, and oftentimes we're just not talked about, or we're erased. And so I think about what benefits, even mental benefits, might come from being able to place the queer body in the center and for those queer bodies to live in their full authenticity. You know this person who is about to flash up on your screen. We had the song a while ago, Donna, thank you so much. This is Whitney Houston. And as I was preparing for this, I had something flash across my screen about Whitney Houston's sexuality. Now it's like, oh, this is just a tablet, right? Did a little digging and research. Well, actually, Whitney Houston had a female lover, a woman lover. Her name was Robin Crawford, and this information has now come out. And so there's conversation surrounding what if this person, who we know that she'd died a tragic life with drug overdoses or addiction, what we would call a disease of despair, what if the fullness of her love in her life could have been centered, right? What if her church gathered around in support of her? Perhaps would she still be here, right? I think in almost a morbid and reductive sense, the gift of examining our faith, examining history through the queer lens, is that we're reminded of the gifts of the queer body and the contributions the queer body has made in society. And we orient ourselves to experience the gift and fullness of being in the queer body here and now. And for that, what I wanted to show you was that we've always been here. And since this is Black History Month, what you're going to see scroll through now is just a few of the Black queer people who have represented us in history, whose story has been erased, but this process of queer theory and queering our theology are bringing these people to the front and centering them again.
Mm-hmm. So we understand on some level that this is drinking from the fire hose. We can, we're kind of just, ripping the Band-Aid off and getting the conversation started. But we know it can't end here. So before we kind of wrap up by getting to some questions that maybe people have been posing, is there anything else that you kind of want to conclude with?
Yeah, like you said, I think this conversation is moving, it's evolving. In 20 years, the use and the understanding of the word queer has shifted and changed. It's gone through this reclamation and this transformation. And queer theology is making immense strides. There's queer theology podcasts and books. And so if you need any resources, email David or email me, or rather email David because his is easier to get to and he can contact me. But I think in secular and in church spaces, there's conversations that are debating the expansive nature of queerness. Questions like, if gender and sexuality exist on a spectrum, then isn't everyone queer? And I would love to say yes to that and blow your mind, but I think that we need to remember that this term, this expression, this identity arises out of people relegated to this process of non-belonging or and finding belonging with one another. So let us be aware of this tendency as people of privilege to sort of insert ourselves into spaces and to see ourselves in the narratives in all stories, lest we erase the experiences and the voices of those relegated to the margins. Let us not shrink back from learning about the queer experience and our wrestling with the divine as we reclaim structures, tangible and intangible, that have sought to silence and oppress, as we are transformed by our being in authentic relationship with an eye towards inclusion of the least of these. May we liberate ourselves and liberate others as we strive to be a community that's awakening and struggling and loving together as though a different world is possible today.
That's all we got. Yeah, so Blair's been texting me some of the questions that have been showing up in the comments. Here's one. So someone asked, sorry, you guys are talking, and so I lost it. Someone asked, can theology be as simple as Jesus saying, "Come as you are"? Yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't know if, like, full stop, yeah. I don't know how much that needs to be unpacked, but when I think about this, I think about that is what Jesus came to embody, and to demonstrate this process of come as you are. It's of note that Jesus didn't start his ministry with the kings and the priests, but he started it with the sex workers and the disabled people out on the margins of society. So in a real way, I think our belief, our grounding is that Jesus says, come as you are, full stop.
Right. Yeah, and so if you want to go deeper into that, kind of what we were gesturing towards or alluding to in the gospel narrative of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection is on some level that notion of coming as you are, that that idea as exactly as you are is enough, is at the heart of God's very being. If God is identifying God's self with the crucified Christ, with kind of this rupture or this cut in the normativity, then there is no standard, there is no ground at which you're comparing yourself to and finding yourself wanting, finding yourself at some sort of deficit. It's in all of your flaws and all of your imperfections, real or imagined, you are enough.
Yeah.
Let's see. Someone asked about the documentary. I think someone said it, responded in the comments, but you were talking about the PBS.
Yes, there is a PBS documentary, The Black Church. You should just look at that because it's Black History Month, and it's fascinating. You get to see how the Black church operates in society. And I think that they talk about really well the benefits, but also the disadvantages, and it really puts it into how the Black church exists and why it exists because of the systems and structures, right? So if, for the purpose of the conversation, there is a podcast called Queering Theology that weekly takes a look at Bible verses and scriptures from the perspective of a queer lens. And so if podcasts are your thing, then that's something that you could also take advantage of, or that, we like book clubs and block clubs and whatnot. So that might be something that we could gather as a group in conjunction with Kindred here, maybe, perhaps.
And so even though Tommy and I didn't want to spend our time talking about apologetics this morning, for some of you, that might be kind of the stage of this journey that you're on, exploring the apologetic, the defenses, the reasoning for full LGBTQ inclusion, maybe from a Christian or a scriptural perspective. And so lots of resources.
God and the Gay Christian pops up to my mind. Matthew Vines.
Yeah, that's a good one. And maybe even more so than the gay or lesbian experience, this might have been some of your first exposure to trans identity and the trans experience. And so some phenomenal resources on that front include, I believe it's called Transformed by Austin Hartke. She's My Dad, which is a memoir by Jonathan and Paula Williams. Jonathan and Paula are both friends of Watershed, both pastors. Jonathan is the founding pastor of Forefront Brooklyn, which is a like-minded community to Watershed up in New York. And Jonathan's parent, Paula, began life as Paul, and a number of years ago transitioned. It's a powerful story. Paula is now a very prolific speaker and pastor. She pastors over at Left Hand Church in Longmont, Colorado. But their story, captured in the book She's My Dad, is a great introduction to the trans experience as well.
Yeah, and if you're looking for a community, there is Q Christian Conference every January. And also, we are familiar with Kevin Garcia and Bad Theology Kills. We use that resource as well. They are a beautiful minister to this community and the world. And
so kind of to wrap up, if there's any other questions, anything, I'm looking through the comments. It looks like we hit most of everything. But if there's something we missed, do not hesitate to email me at david@watershed.charlotte.com. This Thursday, there's going to be a video that comes out called Theological Thursdays, and it's going to be an opportunity for myself and sometimes other dialogue partners to dive a little bit deeper into the message from the prior Sunday. We actually have a backlog of a couple from the previous couple weeks that we haven't had a chance to release yet. So our YouTube channel is where that's going to debut, and we will be using that space hopefully to get to some more questions that maybe we weren't able to get to in this space. So thanks for hanging out. Thanks for joining us. Tommy, thank you just for your vulnerability and your contributions. And
it's always a pleasure to do this with you.
Likewise. All right. See you later.